19th of March 1996. A publican is killed with a blast from a shotgun while counting the day's takings in his pub in County Wicklow.
A man who was known well and a man who was well liked and a person who was well respected.
His wife is also apparently attacked, woken from her sleep by someone pressing her face into a pillow, a knife in his hand.
She said that a man came and had put his hand over her mouth and was shouting, "Where's the jewellery? Where are the effing jewels?"
It was cold, it was calculating, it was brutal. And in a way, it was motivated by greed.
What appears to be a robbery gone wrong turns into something altogether different when the truth behind the attacks is eventually revealed.
The country had never seen anything like this in many respects. It was like the plot of a film.
You know, you had love, you had hate, you had money, you had loads of sex, you had the IRA, and then you had a husband who was a really well-liked, quite gentle giant of a man, and then you had this bitch who wanted him dead.
Evidence eventually points to Catherine Nevin, the woman the press nickname the Black Widow.
She wanted the extramarital affairs. She wanted the money. She wanted the business. And she wanted to have friends in high places. She had all of that. The only thing that was in her way was Tom Nevin.
Her trial is a national cause célèbre. It's not the sort of violent crime you'd expect to happen in a country pub. But in March 1996, Jack White's, one of Ireland's most famous roadside hostelries, was the scene of an extraordinary murder. Its owner, 54-year-old Tom Nevin, was killed by a shotgun blast as he began to shut up his premises for the night. The event would shock patrons and neighbours of the quiet, unassuming publican.
A number of the locals had all expressed off the record utter disgust and shock. And then we began to learn the true story of what was actually happening in Jack White's.
It was a robbery on the upper scale of brutality. And of course, when the ballistics result came through and you see what Tom had been killed with, a bullet of that caliber, which is used normally for shooting big deer or wildlife, you say this was a very cruel act.
The Nevins had met in 1970. Tom Nevin had a pub background and had been in a previous relationship.
He left school at 17 years of age and he went to work for an uncle of his at Dolphin's Barn. And he would have worked there for a good number of years in that pub. And he met a woman and he got married.
He got married in 1962 and lived in England for a while. And they married for about 8 years and then they split up. She actually blamed herself for the split, not Tom.
He came back in 1968 and the marriage had broken down. And in 1970, he actually got the first ever church and state annulment in this country.
Approximately 3 or 4 years after the end of that marriage, he met Catherine Nevin.
By 1976, they were married and had begun to improve their circumstances by acquiring a couple of houses and a pub.
At first, they lived in a house that Tom owned in Rialto. It was a house of flats and Tom lived in the basement, but within 6 months of that, Catherine bought a property in her own name. And within 9 months, she was buying another property, you know, as a couple. So she really had ambitions for them in terms of going up the social ladder and acquiring and achieving. She also wasn't happy that Tom was working as a barman. She wanted him to have his own pub.
They then leased a pub, the Barry House in Finglas, together. And they bought some property as well at the same time. So they bought some lovely houses along the South Circular Road. So they were building up a very substantial property portfolio. Their business was beginning to escalate. Tom was no longer working for his uncle, but he had spent many, many years working in his uncle's pub. Now he was the barman, becoming a publican.
Barry's house was in Finglas, at the bottom of the hill, also known as the Kappa House. A big dungeon of a pub. In the 80s and 70s, it was frequented quite a lot by a lot of the Sinn Féin movement, a lot of the political movement around that side of the city. It was a working man's pub. And it was a place where you went if you needed things sorted out and fixed.
There were a number of individuals that frequented that bar that had links to the IRA, and Catherine spoke and got to know some of these individuals, and that's essentially how Catherine got to know a number of fringe players in the IRA.
The Nevins now had a substantial and growing property portfolio, but the icing on their property cake came with the acquisition of Jack White's in 1986. White's is located close to British Bay, a popular weekend venue for large numbers of Dublin families. All summer, Dubliners flock to the many caravan parks and private holiday homes located nearby.
It was a very popular pub around that area at that time, and was obviously hugely popular with holidaymakers, because a lot of people from Dublin came down from Dublin to British Bay right throughout the whole summer, and also, a lot of people from Arklow would have went out there to the beaches, etc. So it was a very, very popular pub in the Greater Wicklow area.
But it also was located on the main Dublin to Wexford Road, and it was a pub that benefited from huge passing trade from motorists and so on.
It was on the road, which was being improved with EU funding. All of the truckers driving to Rosslare were going to use that pub as a stopover, and it quickly became a very, very big household name.
Catherine made huge efforts to get to know customers who frequented Jack White's, and the more influential, the better.
When they moved to British originally, in the upstairs apartment of the property, Catherine established a grooming beauty salon, primarily for women.
Catherine originally wanted to stay out of the pub side of the business, and she had a tanning bed there for a tanning salon, and she wanted to have a hair sort of salon there too, but there was just no trade, so she wound up in the lounge, and she banished Tom to the bar, and she ended up taking over the food side of things.
Catherine had slowly begun to ingratiate herself into the local community. She had become friends with a number of well-known and influential people in the community.
She became fairly notorious early on that she seemed to target higher members of society, if you like. She was well known for her famous coffees, which were laced with spirits. She would often give these people free meals as well.
And she was more of a pushy woman who was bossy to her staff, and I think she certainly liked driving the business and making the money.
She was very tuned into presentation. But if you're a person, of course, that likes to associate with the top person, you've got to look well.
Tom was typical of many Irish publicans, soft-spoken and reserved. He was happy to run the pub, interact with customers and deal with the business side.
I probably spoke to 40, 50 people who knew him fairly well, including members of his family. And each and every one of them described him as a caring man, a gentle giant, a very, very modest man.
His staff would all describe him as almost like a father figure to them. The staff were all very young people. They were his family. He had no children of his own, and he treated them very, 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 very well. So he was a very decent man, is what he was.
Catherine Nevin was different to her husband, brash and showy. Catherine was far more outgoing and outspoken.
Catherine, according to people who knew her when she was growing up, always stood out. She always wanted better things for herself, and she didn't really socialise, as I understand it, with teenagers of her own age.
There's no doubt that the local community noticed that she displayed notions of grandeur. It was the clothes she wore, it was the jewellery, it was the fact that she was having cosmetic surgery, which was highly unusual in Ireland in the late 80s, early 90s for a woman in her position to be doing. And again, she very much targeted higher members of society, or members of society that she may have considered useful to her.
She seemed to love power and powerful people, and she seemed to think that she was immune to the ordinary things that people, business people had to go through, that she could use her connections, whether they were low life or high life. She didn't believe that she had to go the conventional course.
She certainly was a person who had raised her status, I would say, in life.
It was rumoured that her friendships with some men in the locality had become more than platonic.
By the time Catherine and Tom had bought Jack White's. Their marriage was being described as loveless. They slept in separate rooms and so on. There's no doubt that in the years after they bought Jack White's, that marriage deteriorated, and Catherine, by a number of accounts, had affairs with a large number of men, and sometimes right in Tom's face, for want of a better word, which was a source of huge humiliation for him.
Catherine was increasingly taking on the mantle of somebody who was operating outside of the marital box a lot of the time. Whilst initially nobody really understood the dynamics of the relationship, it soon became clear that she was becoming friendly with a number of male patrons of the pub, and that they appeared to have unfettered access to her. And at times, members of staff had witnessed Tom being extremely annoyed and angry about this. So I think it's fair to say that, within the early days, things weren't going too well.
Catherine and Tom Nevin may have found a basis on which to conduct their marriage, but it appeared that for Catherine, it was not enough.
There doesn't seem to have been an outward tension between the two. It seems to have been almost an arrangement that they would live separate lives.
I once asked the question, why didn't she leave? Most people do. They leave, they don't kill their spouse. And the answer I got was that Catherine Nevin wanted it all.
She decided that there was an easier way to get her hands on everything, and she didn't walk away because she seemed to have been agitating with people from early on that she wanted to get rid of him and basically collect all the money.
Either way, the events of 19th of March 1996 were to change all of that. "54-year-old Tom Nevin was shot dead as he prepared to shut his pub, Jack White's, in County Wicklow on the night of 19th of March 1996. The events of that evening were to have wide-ranging repercussions and was to introduce the Irish public to Tom's wife, Catherine, soon to be dubbed the Black Widow. Tom and Catherine had come to Jack White's in 1986. Over the previous 10 years, the business had done well.
It was the 80s, there was a recession in Ireland, there was huge emigration, and this couple were worth a fortune.
They had a very large sum of cash in their bank account. They had the property portfolio, and they also had, there was a large insurance policy on Tom Nevin's life.
In the days before widespread drink-driving enforcement, the venue had become a popular attraction locally, with regulars travelling from as far north as Wicklow town and as far south as Arklow.
I'd say building up a business like Jack White's took tenacity, and it took skill from a business perspective. Tom was the businessman.
And Catherine was the socialiser.
She loved gossip, she loved talk, she loved attention, and she loved knowing people's business, so she was always mooching around.
She was more interested in high-profile people coming at holiday weekends and looking after what she thought were a better class of customer.
While the pub was always full during the summer, the winter months, the bar was generally populated by a hard core of regulars.
She appeared to have identified who the movers and shakers were within the community. Coincidentally or not, they happened to be individuals involved in law enforcement and, in some cases, members of the judiciary.
Catherine was gaining a serious reputation in the local town and community in terms of being a very dangerous woman, but also a very powerful woman. So on the one hand, people were terrified of her, and on the other, they were slightly fascinated by her.
All of the regulars knew Catherine, and Catherine made sure she met anyone who mattered.
Even if passing celebrities might have stopped in for a cup of coffee, because Jack White's Inn was pretty famous on that route if you were taking it, she was known to say to the staff, "Oh, look who that is, I'll have to go and talk to them." So it would appear that she was instinctively drawn to influential people.
Catherine had already gone upstairs to bed.
Catherine Nevin said that she'd been in the bed, that she had been reading the newspaper and fallen asleep.
When two men burst into her room, pushed her head into the pillow, and were demanding jewellery.
She said that a man came and was shouting, "Where's the jewellery? Where are the effing jewels?"
He tied her up with football headbands and the belt of a dressing gown. So she said that she had her wrists tied with numerous knots and her feet were tied, and then she was hog-tied, her wrists to her feet.
Her initial statement to Garda was that she had actually been bound and gagged and mistreated. Jewellery was thrown about the place in pretty dishevelled manner.
So after she was tied up, the raiders left the room. At that time then she heard the sound of a saucepan falling downstairs.
As if there was a pot dropping. And she said that was the only sound that she had heard.
So they left and she could hear two cars leaving the pub. One of those cars being Tom Nevin's own car. She struggled then to free herself. She said that she managed to free the bindings on her ankles and make her way downstairs to the lobby, the front hall, and press a panic attack alarm.
It was a couple of hours before Catherine raised the alarm.
The initial call to Jack White's Inn had come at 4:31 a.m. and the two Gardaí arrived to the scene.
The Garda arrived to find the outside door to Jack White's open and to find Catherine Nevin inside of the door, pretty scantily clad, as we understood it. Once they had freed Catherine and taken her from the floor where she had evidently crawled from her bedroom upstairs, they went into the kitchen behind the bar in the pub to discover Tom Nevin lying flat on his back, his glasses still on, his pen in his hand and the stool overturned.
Tom Nevin had received a shotgun blast at point-blank range.
He had been shot in the chest, which had resulted in the bullet going into his right shoulder. He would have been dead within seconds.
His chest was blown open with the force of the pellets that entered it.
Local detectives were soon on the scene.
When detectives arrived less than an hour later, her response was, "My darling Tom, my darling Tom." But already they were on high alert because they could not understand how, having been through such a traumatic incident, having managed to get from the bedroom where there were two panic alarms, down the stairs to the door of the pub to press a panic alarm there, what was going on here that didn't add up? Was she just a convenient suspect? No, they didn't think that. They called in the big guns from Dublin because they felt that something was not right here.
Investigators immediately sealed off the crime scene and began their inquiries locally.
One of the first things that was noted in the very initial stages of the investigation was that the entire property didn't appear to have been as dishevelled as it should have been if ruthless criminals with firearms were coming to take a substantial amount of property, be it money, be it jewellery.
The place looked as if there was a total robbery and it was pulled apart, but it was kind of staged. So what it was, we don't know, but there was no witnesses, and so nobody seen. She was upstairs, he was downstairs. Somebody came in, one way or the other, the man was shot dead, but nobody seen what happened. There was absolutely no witnesses whatsoever.
Catherine's behaviour with all of the individual actions being taken together seemed to create a certain level of suspicion.
What at first appeared to be the brutal and seemingly random shooting of a publican in the course of a robbery was soon to turn into the cause célèbre, full of extraordinary twists, the full extent of which was about to be revealed.
In the very initial stages of the investigation, there was something not quite right here.
When 54-year-old publican Tom Nevin was shot dead while preparing to close Jack White's pub in March 1996, his shocking death led to a full-scale Garda investigation.
They found Tom on the floor in the kitchen in a pool of blood, devastating injury to his chest.
Tom Nevin never had a chance.
At first glance, the murder seemed to be the work of a criminal gang in search of the substantial takings of the St. Patrick's holiday weekend a couple of days before.
I suppose at the time there was this fear of criminals coming down from Dublin and raiding pubs, so they may have believed the cover story.
Catherine Nevin told Gardaí she had been awakened by two men in her room and that they had threatened her, looking for jewellery and money. But investigators were soon to discover that all at Jack White's was not what it seemed on the surface.
But all the evidential aspects of it were accumulating, possibly pointing in another direction.
There were several things noticed by investigators that suggested Catherine's story wasn't as she had suggested.
The front door had not been damaged in any way. No fingerprints were found anywhere on the property as ballistics guys got to work over the next couple of days.
So that caused concern. All the windows and doors externally had been checked and there was no sign of any break-in. Downstairs, upstairs or anywhere, the premises was firmly secured. And then the jewellery from Catherine's bedroom was strewn along the corridors upstairs, down the stairs, through the pub, down towards the kitchen, like a trail to follow.
But interestingly, despite what Catherine had claimed about the raiders looking for jewellery, it later emerged that they never got any jewellery at all. And in fact, the only fingerprints that were found on Catherine Nevin's jewellery box were her own.
What was also interesting is that there were 2 panic alarms in Catherine's bedroom, yet she made it from that bedroom upstairs, down past a broken staircase with a TV thrown up against the side of the staircase, and down to the door of the pub where the panic alarm was actually activated. None of this made sense to the investigating Gardaí, the initial Gardaí, even at the scene.
Catherine's protestations that she had been attacked and that she had been roughly handled by the intruders didn't appear to stack up either.
She was examined by a doctor that morning of the murder very soon after she was freed, and she had no marks of bindings on her ankles whatsoever, and she was bound by the same person, so you'd expect there to be severe marks there on her ankles. There was a gap there of 2 3/4 hours there where she would have been tied up, so you would expect deep indentations of red marks on her ankles, similar to what was on her wrists. And you'd ask yourself the question, if they were prepared to kill Tom Nevin in such cold blood, why did they not kill Catherine? Why did they leave her there to tell their story? All of these things didn't look right. There was something wrong there.
Gardaí were in no doubt, though, how Tom Nevin had met his death.
He was shot from 3 feet away.
It was a shotgun, but not with your normal size pellet that might be used for shooting. It was described as an assassin's pellet.
A cartridge which contained 9 pellets of .33 inch caliber, similar to being shot 9 times with a revolver, all in one blast at close range, ripping through his side, through his lungs, through his heart, and lodging in his left upper shoulder, propelling him off the stool where he sat at his worktop, onto his back, facing upwards, with his glasses still intact on his face and his pen in his hand. He would have died instantly. This type of cartridge that was used in the murder of Tom Nevin had never before been seen in the murder in this country. It was the first time this type of cartridge was used in a killing in Ireland.
Fortunately for him at the time, in pretty immediate death, but the impact of the slug could not have done anything but kill the man.
Gardaí had to maintain the respect which a widow of a man murdered in such appalling circumstances would deserve. But the Catherine Nevin show was about to begin.
I remember being at the funeral the week afterwards, and she put on a fantastic act of the grieving widow. I was enthralled by this because to me it looked like a performance from what I'd already heard from various detectives.
What struck me about Tom Nevin's funeral was that Catherine didn't cry. Catherine had stood there in a very well publicised photograph with a red rose to her face.
Some people made the comments that they thought that she may have been smiling behind that rose.
As investigations began in earnest, Gardaí concentrated their efforts on the group of people who had interacted with the Nevins on a day-to-day basis.
We needed to focus on the staff. The staff would be in a position to give us the routine.
A lot of local people worked in Jack White's, and it was hell for them.
She was very much the controlling presence. What she said went, and she was a domineering figure.
There was one story that always stood out in my head, and that was the story of Kathleen Stafford. Kathleen was a single mum who did a lot of odd jobs down in the pub, and Catherine asked her to work full time, and she couldn't because she had a son who came home from school in the afternoon, so she could only do mornings. So Catherine reported her to social welfare. She didn't just report her to the local social welfare office, she went to the head honcho in Dublin. There was an investigation, and it was discovered that Kathleen was being overpaid by £6. So she was a really vindictive, cruel woman.
The investigation also threw up some interesting phone numbers of people with whom the Gardaí knew for entirely different reasons. Willie McLean, a convicted fraudster, was a man with whom Catherine had had a past.
Tom knew that Catherine was having an affair with Willie McLean.
And in fact, at one stage, he was in bed with Catherine Nevin upstairs in Jack White's, and Tom Nevin walked into the bedroom.
That had been witnessed by a member of staff. This was in an upstairs room in the house. Tom Nevin slept downstairs in the house. They hadn't shared rooms in many years. Catherine asked Willie to kill Tom on a number of occasions. She asked him to shoot him and also to have him shot. Willie McLean's words to me were, he told her, "You must be fucking joking." He said that he couldn't believe that she had the naivety, as I remember he described it at the time, to come to him so openly and publicly and ask him to kill Tom. He said he asked her why, and he said that she said Tom was beating her up, that Tom was abusive and violent towards her. And Willie McLean did not believe that for 1 minute and said that he would not help her.
The Gardaí also came across the details of another man they knew, John Jones.
John Jones's name and telephone number was discovered in the pub during the course of the search. As soon as he was approached and told, "Your name was got down in Jack White's inn there in a search there recently. We're investigating the Nevin murder. Do you know anything about it, or are you in any position to assist us or help us?" And immediately John Jones says, "I think we need to sit down and talk." And he told his story.
John Jones was another of Catherine Nevin's male acquaintances. He ran a Sinn Féin advice clinic in Finglas.
Jones got to know Catherine Nevin again from the Barry house. Jones would have had links to a number of Sinn Féin men in the Finglas area in the mid-80s, and would have known Catherine from drinking and so on in the Barry house pub in Finglas.
He said that Catherine Nevin had approached him on a number of occasions asking that her husband be assassinated.
What she suggested was that the ideal time would be a bank holiday weekend when there would be a lot of people down from Dublin, the pub would be full, and that there would be over 25,000 in takings, and that this would then be a staged bank robbery that went wrong, and that Tom Nevin would get killed in the process.
And the reason for killing him was that he's beaten me up. She called into John Jones' advice centre one day, and she had dark glasses on her face, and she had marks on her wrists. The dark glasses were covering bruised eyes where she had received cosmetic surgery to her eyes. Not only was he shocked, he was affronted, and he was insulted by the suggestion that was being put to him. He wasn't that type of person at all, and he had a certain level of disgust with regard to what she was at, and he reported it obviously further up the line in his own community. And Catherine was called in and she was told that what she was at was not going to be tolerated and she was to stop. But she didn't. She continued on. That's probably the reason that John Jones was so concerned about this. This is not what we do, and this will not be tolerated. Tom Nevin is a decent person, a businessman. What a horrible proposition that she was putting. He was quite genuinely shocked, and he was genuine in everything he did with respect to the investigation as well.
Gardaí were able to take note of another familiar name, someone else Catherine had on her list of potential assassins.
Jerry Heaps was different in that one day Joe Collins, Detective Garda Joe Collins, and I arrived out to the pub to talk to Catherine. There was a newspaper on the table. I picked up the newspaper to look at it, and when I glanced down, I saw the name Jerry Heaps, which was a name I knew from my time in the inner city in Dublin, task forces in Dublin City. And I thought it was unusual that Jerry Heaps' name, it's an unusual name firstly. I thought it was very unusual that somebody of Catherine Nevin's background would have Jerry Heaps' name and telephone number in her telephone and address directory. And then the following month, a search took place on the pub in Jack White's. And when the telephone and address directory was checked, we discovered that now Jerry Heaps' name had been scribbled out both front and back. So that was a significant little piece of evidence.
She took him to one of their rental properties on the South Circular Road. She proposed that Tom be taken out there and that it looked like a botched robbery as he was collecting rents from the tenants. Jerry Heaps then went to his associates and told them what Catherine Nevin was trying to get him to get the IRA to do. He then gave evidence that he had spoken to two men in a pool hall, and that the men had said Catherine Nevin had to be watched and that everything was to be reported. Now, the word on the street at the time was that the IRA felt that Catherine Nevin was giving them a bad name, and they wanted to ensure that none of their members would ever be involved in this crime.
Whilst he was in Garda custody, he was reluctant to say anything, but he did come back to us at a later stage, and he did speak to us about Catherine Nevin's approaches to him to kill Tom Nevin. But Jerry Heaps was never going to kill Tom Nevin because Jerry Heaps had great time for Tom Nevin.
It was known that she had connections to these men, and of course they didn't have any of the loyalty that she thought they had to her, and they were quite prepared to save themselves by telling detectives how she had propositioned them over a fair number of years and asked and put forward various scenarios.
In a painstaking and detailed investigation, Gardaí had built up significant amounts of evidence. They were now in a position to charge Catherine Nevin.
Catherine Nevin is to be charged with murder, but she is also to be charged with 3 counts of soliciting to murder, which was very unusual in this country. We didn't anticipate that, and of course it was brilliant work by the DPP's office to bring that matter to our attention and alert us to that is also a criminal offence. She was arrested by me in Dublin on Poplar Row when she was heading over, I think, to the bank that morning. We stopped the car, I got out and I walked up to the door and I just knocked on the window and I says, "Catherine, you probably know why I'm here." I just opened the door and I said, "Listen, Catherine, I'm here to arrest you for the murder of Tom and you're going to be going to the bridewell and you're going to be charged." And she just got out of the car, she said nothing, and she got into the back of the car with a female Garda officer and we drove down to the bridewell and there was not a word spoken.
From the moment Catherine Nevin was arrested, it appeared to bring a huge sense of relief to those who lived in the vicinity of Jack White's. People drove by, honking the horn, delighted that she had been arrested.
Catherine Nevin was now in custody, and what was to emerge during the course of her trial was to shock the Irish public and forever seal the notoriety of the Black Widow.
It was fueled with lies which nobody had ever heard before.
When 54-year-old Tom Nevin was shot dead as he prepared to shut his pub, Jack White's in County Wicklow, on the night of the 19th of March 1996, neither the investigators or the public could have imagined the secrets behind the incident.
They frankly didn't believe that Tom Nevin was the victim of a botched robbery.
There was no signs of a struggle whatsoever. He was taken by surprise, but it was all over in less than 1 second, I would say.
He was a gentle giant who was blown away in cold blood.
His wife, Catherine, the woman the press had now dubbed the Black Widow, was accused of the murder and with soliciting people to kill Tom.
Garda had become aware that she'd attempted to get 3 separate men to murder her husband Tom.
I think the fact that Catherine Nevin felt that she could approach certain individuals in society and be protected from any hint of suspicion was sheer lunacy.
Catherine Nevin's trial was to become the longest trial in Irish history at that time.
The trial itself didn't happen until the year 2000, 3 years after, and it started on the 12th of January 2000 and lasted until the 11th of April 2000.
The media covered proceedings comprehensively, and there was a great sense of expectation across the country.
Well, the trial was huge because there was a fascination with the idea of a woman who would actually kill out of greed and not for any sort of reason of, abuse.
There was a lot of argument made at the time that because of the publicity surrounding the case, that perhaps there should be an interim period. But Judge Carroll rejected that on the basis that looking for a fade factor.
The trial became something of a media circus, with Catherine Nevin very much at the centre of the show.
It was generally the feeling that Catherine got a kick out of being the centre of attention.
Catherine Nevin did play for the media. The media were fascinated by this woman, the clothes that she wore, the makeup she had, the books she read.
The way that she acted seemed to suggest that she loved the celebrity of it, and it was hard to ignore this kind of behaviour, and people couldn't help but write about it because it was so striking.
So much so that the judge, I think, made an order telling the press not to be writing all about her suits and how she was dressing for court, that it was irrelevant because there was so much attention being paid to the dress sense of Catherine Nevin.
When Catherine took the stand, she appeared determined to maintain her own version of what had happened to her husband.
From the minute she took the witness box, Catherine Nevin just did what she always did, which was tell compulsive, pathological lies.
She denied having approached not 1, not 2, but 3 separate individuals, one of them with pretty serious Republican connections, to murder Tom Nevin. The lies went on and on and on. Lies of him being an alcoholic, lies of him being a wife beater.
I know she alleged during the trial, and the judge got very annoyed about it, that her husband was involved in the IRA, but Tom Nevin's family always denied this. So the only one maintaining that Tom Nevin was involved in the IRA was Catherine Nevin herself.
The judge would say at the end that she had assassinated him twice. She had assassinated him in real life by having him killed, and then she had assassinated his character in the witness box.
The verdict took a long time in coming.
The Nevin case was unique in that it was a case that was built on circumstantial evidence. So evidence was coming along in small pieces, drip-fed over a lengthy period of time. There were 231 witnesses in this case. Obviously the staff, customers in the pub on the day, Gardaí, Technical Bureau people, the 3 subornees again, Heaps, McLean and Jones, and of course they were the 3 main witnesses in the case. It was 61 days in total that Judge Mela Carroll sat, and the jury deliberations in this case took 26 hours and 35 minutes.
It was the longest deliberation by any jury in this country. It took them 5 days to come to a verdict.
Catherine received a life sentence for murder and 3 separate sentences for solicitation.
Soliciting to murder in this country was not a charge that people were familiar with. People were more familiar with the word conspiracy to murder as opposed to soliciting.
Even behind bars, Catherine Nevin has continued her lifelong strategy of positioning herself for her own best advantage.
She befriended a lot of women who, in exactly the same way as when she was outside in society, she befriended influential people. She made friends with powerful people in prison, people who were of use to her.
Despite her conviction and the overwhelming body of evidence against her, she has steadfastly continued to protest her innocence.
She has never admitted to having her husband killed. She's always completely denied it. She appealed the conviction 3 times, and it's just something she's never owned up to.
She may have convinced herself, actually, that she was the wronged party, because she has appealed year after year. I think the last appeal went up to 2013. So she is in complete denial that she was responsible for the murder of Tom Nevin.
Catherine has never shown an ounce of remorse, be it publicly to those of us who observed her before and during the trial. Since she has been released on temporary release on a regular basis, she has not appeared to display any remorse or empathy or any sense of sadness about the events.
The thing for her would have been to come clean and tell the truth and, tell the world who the real killer was, who actually pulled the trigger on Tom Nevin, who went into the house with a gun and shot him and took his life, who was the hitman that she hired, how much did she pay him, where did she get him. And then I think there would be some sort of justice for the Nevin family. But to this day, even though she's been convicted, they don't know who physically went into the house and pulled the trigger. They have no idea who did that.
Unless Garda make a breakthrough as to identifying the murderer, I don't believe we will ever find out who pulled the trigger on Tom Nevin.
She will take who pulled the trigger to the grave. People ask me, would you not go and talk to Catherine and ask her, or do you think she would tell you? I wouldn't go and talk to her, or I wouldn't ask her. If she rang me and said to me, I'd like to talk to you, I would go and see her, yes. But unless she was prepared to come and tell me, I spent more time with her, myself and Joe Collins spent more time with her than anybody else. And if anyone was going to be told, I think she would have told us. I think that's a secret that only Catherine knows, and the person that killed Tom Nevin. But the case that would be made against the person who killed Tom Nevin would be a completely different case than the case that was made against Catherine Nevin. And you couldn't rule out, certainly, that somewhere along the way that some piece of evidence could arise, or some phone call could be made at some time that just might crack open that question that still remains there. It's still there, it's still open, it's still fresh, and there's still possibilities. You just never know.
There are many tragedies surrounding the events of 19th of March 1996. Over 20 years after the crime, mystery still surrounds that night, and its effects have been widespread.
I think there was a real tragedy here for a number of families. For the Gardaí, even the individuals she had relationships with and friendships with, they had families, they had lives. Their lives were ruined, and most of all, Tom Nevin's family, his extended family, his nieces, his nephews. He had no children. The man had a very promising future. He was a gentle giant who was blown away in cold blood because Catherine Nevin wanted more.